How long do I have? 30 minutes, right?
Yes.
Amazing. So, welcome everyone. I know I might not look like it, but I'm technically considered an academic. And today we're going to play a bit with my favorite thing after V6, which is DNS. So, quick recap. We all know what best current practice is, which is you do not use IPv6. You're laughing, but that is actually what RFC 3901 kind of says. So 3901, it's very recent, so published in 2004. It provides DNS IPv6 operational guidelines. And it says that all recursives should, of course, be at least IPv4 only, or if you kind of want to and you somewhat feel like it, you can also do like dual stack. So in short, IPv4 only allowed, IPv6 not required. The same thing for the authoritative sites. You can do V6 if you really want to, but you must really do IPv4 because IPv4 is the internet. And more crucially, if you happen to be a TLD, is somebody from Nominet around? So if you happen to be a TLD, you must, or should, it's like the copying out soft version of a must, you should ensure that at least one IPv4 authoritative works. While there is some tumbleweed when it comes to the question of whether V6 actually works. So that is BCP. That is the best current practice we're currently working with. And you might get the idea, maybe we should have worked on this. Like we should have changed that because the impact of this is pretty clear. So this is a study we published 2-3 years ago where we took a historic data set from Farsight, the Farsight SIE data set, which is essentially recursive resolver cache misses, which allows us to see like glue, actually Apex provided data for NS records along with like their, well, A and quad A records. And if you use that to calculate who can actually be resolved by IPv6, you figure out that it's by that time only roughly 60% of zones. And we had this thing about big impact of individual players. I don't know whether you see it, but there's this little jump in 2017, which is like 15–17% of all zones all of a sudden becoming IPv6 only resolvable. Well, somebody kind of forgot that you need to have IPv6 glue to make IPv6 DNS resolution happening, and that somebody happened to host like 17% of all zones out there. So yeah, big players can have a big impact. Anyway, point being, apparently we have IANA kind of following 3901, following this whole thing of like, yeah, you know, V4 is kind of a must, but V6 me. And that trickles down through the tree because they tell their TLDs like, hey, if you want to be in the root zone, you have to have V4, right? And V6 if you kind of want to. The TLDs kind of got the memo, but their requirements are still copy-pasted from IANA. So if you get a domain from a TLD, they are like, hey, you have to have V4. Yeah, V6, whatever. So that's where we are. And roughly 10 years ago, some people got the idea of like, maybe this is not the best idea. Maybe we need to do more V6. It didn't go that well. There were some very loud, very prominent voices being like, nope. If you do IPv6 for DNS, you will break the internet. And DNSSEC makes it even worse. And that discussion basically was the same thing 10 years ago as it is today. We have the issue that IPv6 does not allow on-path fragmentation. Path MTU discovery is notoriously difficult for IPv6. I still have to see that it's better for V4, but that's probably just personal experience. Large fragments are being dropped, which is funny. Just for a quick show of hands. 6830 in the room? LGI? No, good. Spoilers. So fragments are being dropped because they are a security issue. I still don't get why, but anyway. And you need them to get DNS over UDP working if you do DNSSEC because DNSSEC DNS key records are huge. TCP fallback, I mean TCP is equal to IPv6, a relatively new protocol. Some of you might have started deploying it. So that apparently also often breaks. And DNSSEC will trigger even more TCP fallbacks, and TCP fallbacks are just painful. There's a blog article from 2015 discussing all these arguments, making the same arguments, dividing apart and together, why essentially you do not have to worry about all those monsters painted under your beds in the form of DNSSEC and IPv6, but, well, we didn't listen, and here we are. So, I went to the IETF, young, motivated, and tried to change that, and I heard the same things as 10 years ago. So I figured out, well, maybe we can enrich this discussion with some data. So we did some research, and as I said, even though I don't look like it, I'm an academic, so I do like these research paper things, and I do research questions. So we want to know, does DNS resolvability suffer when using IPv6? So do we see more timeouts? Is there more serve fails? I mean, serve fails are these funny things you usually see if you try to do DNS resolution via IPv6, and the other side is not in those 60% that can do IPv6 only resolution. Or do we see more TCP fallbacks, which might be as a result of more timeouts if things break over UDP? Then, of course, we want to see what the impact is of challenging MTU situations, because here everyone makes sure that their users always get an untainted, clear 1500 MTU at home, right? Yeah, I thought so. Of course, we also want to know whether fragmentation is different for DNS over IPv4 or IPv6. We want to see whether IPv6 fragment dropping negatively impacts DNS performance. And in the end, we also want to understand, like, what is DNSSEC doing? And as a little bit of an extra for this presentation, I also took a look at NAT64, because I heard that's kind of the new thing. So what do we do? So we first get the Google Crooks top 10 million domains, like a small set to work with. And then we want to resolve that. And we want to resolve that using a DNS resolver that is, does this thing have a laser pointer? And we first want to resolve that using an MTU of 1500 to the internet. Then we want to have a resolver that has an MTU of 1280 on the link directly of the resolver, which means that we do have, thanks. Which means that we do have the advantage that our host always knows what MSS to set, because it knows on my link it's 1280. Then we break path MTU discovery for that scenario by telling our router here in front, you know what, packet too big, you don't need that in either direction. And then we also do a really nasty one where we have our host doing DNS resolution on a link with an MTU of 1500, introduce an on-link, like on-path, MTU break to 1280, and also drop all path MTU discovery packets. As you might realize, this looks somewhat symmetric, because what we additionally test is, because I heard a rumor that the tier 1 is actually dropping IPv6 fragments on transit, we're doing that once upstreamed via LGI and once not upstreamed via LGI. Now, if we have 10 million domains, resolving those would be a bit lengthy. So doing a full set roughly takes 2.5 days, which gets a lot more boring if you want to do this like really, really often, because you want to have like a temporal perspective. You basically want to do one of these resolutions per day. And that's why we introduced a concept called minimally covering NS sets. So that basically means that for all those 10 million domains, we identify all the NS sets involved. And for each NS set, split by domains with DNSSEC and without DNSSEC, we pick one domain and resolve that. Because in the end, behavior of an NS set to DNS resolution should kind of be the same, right? No matter which of the domains you query, at least if you distinguish between DNSSEC and no DNSSEC. So minimally covering NS sets might sound a bit odd, and it's also basically more like a NS set of it's complicated. But the idea is from Petter, and as I learned, basically when you say Petter and DNS, that's a bit like saying Ben and routing. They are all kind of called Petter. Anyway, but this one works for ISC and had the idea of doing that to be able to better load test their resolver, because they are also producing a resolver, and test it against all the oddities you find out there, because we all know the internet is a collection of corner cases. And we will usually find the worst ones of those Friday afternoon. If we're lucky, otherwise it's Saturday morning, 4 a.m. Anyway, of course, these minimally covering in assets might be a bit problematic because we are aggregating things. There is some special people very close to my heart that are of the opinion that they need to have like over 100,000 different NS sets using a myriad of different second-level domains. Big cloud operator. And also Cloudflare is not that much better. They have like a lot of different NS sets. And of course, if we just do a minimally covering an asset, they would get some decent exposure in there. And furthermore, I hinted at that earlier, right? Like this 17% jump. Some of these NS sets are just really dominant. They basically like have all the domains. So we did an analysis, like 18, 19% of all domains are hosted by one operator. So what is the impact of what when we do this aggregation? For that, we again took our Google Crooks, did all these chunks, and we sliced the data differently. So we did the minimally covering an asset thing. We also did another set where we actually aggregated all these people using far too many NS sets for their hosting, like Amazon. Then we did one full domain list where we just cut out all the heavy hitters, like the big ones. And then we also built a minimally covering an asset over that. That is now just some methodological validation to show you that this minimally covering asset thing, which we will be using in the rest of the talk, actually kind of works. And what you need to take away from this is two main things. So we have a radial plot here, and these are the timeout rates for DNS resolution over all domains, or like the set. There's a lot less noise for IPv6. So broken legacy stuff you will find less often in IPv6. The overall set is also smaller. And this scaling what we do here. So timeout rates get a lot worse, especially for v4, if we're kicking out all those big operators. So if we're getting rid of GoDaddy, Cloudflare, Amazon, all of a sudden the average timeout rate goes up by a lot. And if we just look at the full domain set, v6 is actually doing a bit better than v4 and dual stack. Probably because of that less in noise and things that are just there for forever. If we then do the scaling, then v6 actually doesn't change that much, because we do not have that many NS sets that behave differently depending on how many domains you query against them. In v4, well, v4 looks a lot better if you only query one domain per NS set. Why exactly? I personally suspect legacy. If we then do the scaling, you see for IPv6 this pretty much is a dead-on hit, and this is, by the way, without DNSSEC. And for v4, due to these inconsistently answering NS sets, we have a bit more of a difference, and even here with the scaling, v4 looks better than it actually should. And the blue stuff here is the full domain list and the full perspective. So, DNSSEC gets a bit more noisy, especially the case of having 1280 on path really doesn't make DNS resolution happy. The overall picture is still the same. With the minimal NS set, v4 looks better than it actually is. v6 is a lot closer together. And when we do the scaling, v6 again gets pretty close to the actual data we get when we query all zones, while for v4, there is quite some distance. Now, bottom line of that, our minimally covering NS sets kind of work, especially if you want to relatively understand whether v6 is at least feasible. In the data I will be presenting next, v6 is playing with a little bit of a drawback. Like they get a kind of delayed start. Keep that in mind when we come to the relative numbers there. There's a small fraction of NS sets that have mixed return codes, and there's domain parking involved. Those are actually covering like 40% of zones, which of course makes our data look a bit different. However, these are also most likely zones that do not really impact your customers every day. Because I mean, domain parking is not, it's usually not an end user's revenue stream. And if we do the scaling, we get closer to what we would expect, especially for v6. And for our relative comparisons we will be doing, this is mostly fine. The most important thing is, if we do the DNS resolution with a full set, we will need roughly 3.5 hours for the zones without DNSSEC, and an additional 15 minutes for zones with DNSSEC. Yeah, by the way, DNSSEC adoption is really low on the internet, like really low. If we do the reduction, we can get by in roughly half an hour for both. Is this a fire alarm? Okay, amazing. I mean, some prominent voices do everything to keep me from talking. So let's look at a comparison of what happens if we are comparing DNS resolution via v4 and via v6. And what we kind of have here is we have EDNS 1232 set and EDS 4096. So 1232, it's a little bit more strict than what RFC 9715 is recommending, but what most implementations based on the DNS flag they are going for. And EDNS 4096, you're basically pretending to the other side that you're not really into, well, caring about fragmented DNS packets. What we have here is color scale with which we color these boxes. These boxes are basically A minus B. So we take the value for IPv4 DNS resolution or IPv6 DNS and subtract it. And the coloring is then based on whether v4 is smaller than v6 or v4 is larger than v6. And these are all percentages which we are subtracting. And at 1232, we are talking about like 0.3% where v4 timeouts are larger with DNSSEC, to like without DNSSEC 0.12% where v6 has more timeouts than v4. That's a somewhat reasonable range. And keep in mind the absolute values there are still, I think, around 2%-ish. What really is striking here is this bar. So this is surfail. And if you recall one of the first slides, there should be roughly 40-ish%, hopefully a bit more because that data ended in 2022, of zones that cannot be resolved by IPv6, which maps really well to these 32.61-ish% of zones which we cannot resolve, get a surfail. That is without DNSSEC. If we look at DNSSEC, it goes down to a little bit under 10%, which is a bit odd. It's nearly like IPv6 is good for DNSSEC or the other way around. Or maybe people who are using this century's technology just use all of them. Who knows? They at least also follow the DNS flag day. And if we look at EDNS 496, we of course start seeing a lot more fragments. Interestingly, there are some cases where we see more fragments for v6 than for v4. So it can't be that different. We do have, however, also a relatively small baseline of hosts where the DNS set is just broken. That is what we also discussed in like that paper I referenced on that overview slide. There is a lot of zones where v6 is misconfigured. So where there is a v6 address in glue that just doesn't exist anymore. My former host institution, not my current one, was guilty of that for ages. There is all the good stuff like, you know, v4 map v6 addresses, random garbage, link local addresses. all the good stuff being put into DNS, being put into glue records, which of course then doesn't work. Which brings us back to the issue of we should change 3901, because otherwise there's no incentive for registrars to actually check. Like for them, it's just like, yeah, you have a quad A record, I don't care. Like, I checked your v4 works, meh. So that is something we can actually get rid of, like where we can make performance better by doing more v6. For broken path MTU discovery, IPv4 has more timeouts with DNSSEC at EDNS 0.1232 than IPv6 for some weird reason, which might, in fact, again be, well, people using the Centuries technology are using RFC 9715 and are doing the smart thing. Now, fragment drop rates. So one tier 1, and I already hinted at them, 6830 used to drop IPv6 fragments on transit, like not their transits into their network, but where they provide transit for, which I personally kind of disagree with. And luckily at the ITF meeting in Bangkok in March, I met one of their engineers who was like, yeah, we doing what? They fixed this very quickly. So like as for timescale, so the ITF meeting was here. This was my upstream losing its router, so that's fine. So they had the first tests, which are hardly visible, around there. They started rolling out around there. And as soon as I was behind one of the routers where they had rolled out their new policies, I started to see an increasing amount of fragments via them. So turnaround time from idea to implement to globally rolled out for a full tier 1 of 3 months. I'm personally a bit impressed. Right? That usually doesn't go as fast in my little hobby train network thing. So kudos. Anyway, result, actually more IPv6 fragments in some cases than IPv4 fragments, specifically in the IPv6 on 1280 on path with broken path MTU discovery. So fragmentation in v6 can't be that bad. What they also enable us to do is taking a look at what does it now do to us? Because if the claim initially made, like, hey, IPv6 fragmentation all very bad, is true, then we should have seen a huge impact while we were doing DNS resolution via them, while they were still dropping fragments, right? Well, I think the biggest one is this 0.03%, which is well in the range of noise. So even for EDNS 4096, so the effective worst case, dropping fragments does not notably impact timeout percentages in DNS resolution, even for DNSSEC-enabled domains. Of course, you see more TCP fallbacks. Makes sense, because you have to do more TCP, and you have to hope that TCP somehow converges to the right MSS, which is not that easy if you do not get path MTU discovery packets. I mean, MTU black holes also hurt web traffic, not only quick. But in the end, it just doesn't matter. Bring us to our most favorite thing to decommission, NAT64. What is probably interesting here is that for the NAT64 tests, there was not a high difference between having the on-path MTU break and the on-link MTU break. Most likely because due to the setup of the NAT64, the MSS information kind of got lost for the host. Or I have a bug in my measurement setup. Both pretty possible. Broken path MTU discovery is still very TCP fallback heavy, even with EDNS 1232. And yeah, kind of if you can do native, do native. Like, don't pipe this through a stateful box. Dual stack kind of also suffers a bit with on-path MTU breaks, but they all do. Even IPv4 is not happy if you have an on-path MTU black hole. It's like killing. And overall, what we found when we tried NAT64 was that it is somewhat consistent with our previous findings, and native is always better. If we look at NAT64 versus dual stack in this nice comparison thing again, right, with a plus and minus, this also is like highlighting the spot where NAT64 is for an on-link MTU break performing worse. And for the rest, it's kind of okay-ish. But then again, you also bought a NAT64 box, and they are probably not cheap. So again, base point, do native resolution when you can. So let's wrap this up. Does DNS resolvability suffer when using IPv6? No. There are some baseline differences, but these are most likely due to people having broken setups. And we can fix those broken setups if we start to mandate IPv6 on authoritatives, like same class citizen as IPv4. What is the impact of challenging ANTU scenarios on DNS resolvability? Differences between v4 and v6 are still limited. Following RFC 9715, and I hope all your resolvers and authoritatives do that, really, really helps. Does fragmentation differ for DNS over IPv4 and IPv6? Yep, it did in our measurements up until LGI stopped dropping fragments. Then they were kind of the same-ish. Access networks, though, still might differ. Then again, access networks are also pretty hard to control, and I don't know how many of you are running their recursors, like the ones sending the queries, behind their customer CPEs. Usually those are actually like, you know, from the CPE to your recursors, and your recursors are then in your network you control. So you could think about like DMZing that out to actually have IPv6 fragments there if you're currently dropping that. Do v6 fragment drops negatively impact DNS resolvability? Well, that's the other thing. They don't really do it. So even if you drop the fragments, it doesn't matter. Just make sure you follow RFC 9715. And what is the impact of DNSSEC on DNS resolvability over IPv4 and IPv6? We didn't get into those graphs, but DNSSEC's impact is actually kind of there. But that is mostly related to things being broken. And overall, people doing DNSSEC seem to be more likely to also do v6 and also likely to adopt 9715. So it seems like new technology makes new technology seem nice. And with that conclusion, we are ready for more IPv6 in the internet. Fragmentation is not a problem. Misconfigured IPv6 kind of is. So we should update that guidance to should check. v4 performance is not necessarily better. And what I heard during the last IETF meeting is that especially if you have a lot of clients, like a lot of clients, like these NAT CGN gateways can make IPv4 performance really, really poor, especially if they are doing like some form of XLAT. Well, or minimal recovering and assets work. And please don't do NAT64, just do IPv6 like it's supposed to be done. If you want to have any of this data, there is a website with that data. If you want to have all of that data, please write me an email and I will configure NFS access, because scraping that via HTTP does not make my servers happy. Thank you.
Just want to say thank you for challenging the received orthodoxy about this that has been repeated for quite so long. And I think doing the measurement is important to back it up, but asking the questions in a clear state to actually make some change in that position is really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
James Rice, Jump Networks. A quick Google search for, quote, deny IPv6 any fragments, quote, shows that there might be some people that we both know who might need to update their recommendations for IPv6 filtering.
Do you want to name and shame?
Like you can show me and I name and shame.
Oh,
Who is that?
Oh, this is Philip Smith.
I don't...
Oh, okay.
Wait. Phil's?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to him. But he is doing enterprise networks and, like, you know, behind the network boundary. He is not left to play with transit, hopefully. I mean, your network, your rules, but please don't drop transit traffic you don't like, as long as it doesn't hurt.
Hi, well, I'm only eating into my own time. So. As an editor of the 8504 BIS, the node requirements, I think your name is alongside a comment in the issue tracker. Do you have any general comments for anything that we could change or add to the node requirements for hosts?
Node requirements?
Yeah, is there anything we should change or add to make this any better than it is?
Like I think node requirements are not really that much of an issue. There's a discussion with Lorenzo about like resolver selection, where like the 3901 BIS basically will go like, other people are taking care of this, just do what they say. Like the 6724, like the source address selection thing, and just go with that. I do have some personal wishes, which would be starting to require node requirements that a v6 node, if she has a v4 address on an interface and receives an NDP packet asking for the v4 mapped, like v4, v6 mapped address for that v4 address, should answer with an NDP response. But I think that there are some people in the IETF who would mildly disagree on that, but that would get rid of ARP. Apart from that, I think this is nothing where the node really has to do anything. The node is fine.
It's the misconfigurations is what you're highlighting as well.
Yeah, but you can't patch those without telling people to check. So we should.
Okay, all right, thank you.